Welcome to the Center for Climate and Security's Climate and Security podcast. I am your host, Dr. Sweta Chakraborty. Regular listeners will know that twice a month we aim to bring you exclusive dialogues with the world's leading thinkers, educators, civil servants, and military personnel who work at the nexus of climate and security. I asked these experts to share with us their views and perspectives on how we can collectively prepare at this time of high consequence risk, particularly that of climate change. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Louise Van Schaik. She's a senior member of the Executive Committee for the International Military Council on Climate and Security and is head of the Clingendael International Sustainability Center at the Clingendael Institute. She's also the project manager of the Planetary Security Initiative. Louise is a visiting professor at the College of Europe in Bruges. Her research has extensively analyzed the European Union's performance in multilateral bodies, including the fields of climate change and health and food standards. She has also published on related research areas, such as EU foreign policy, EU climate change and energy policy, EU research policy, scarcity of natural resources and green growth as well. It is my pleasure to speak today with Louise. Louise, thank you so much for joining me today to be a guest on the Climate and Security podcast. It's a pleasure to have you. And I'd love to chat to you a little bit and have our listeners find out more about the work that you do here in Europe. Tell us a little bit about what got you interested in the climate and security nexus and what really raised your awareness to how important it was to contribute your time and resources to advancing this space.
So my background is very much in how the EU operates in international climate change negotiations and also other negotiations. So then I started to work in the Clingendael Institute in the Netherlands, which is traditional security think tank and the diplomatic academy. And all of a sudden questions came up about the security angle of climate change. So I was asked, to start investigating into the topic, to look into the topic. And I was really fascinated by issues like the Arctic, but also the intensification of droughts, what it could mean for specific areas. Also the link, for instance, on food security that goes back to the French Revolution, in the times of the Arab Spring. So I started to follow this and I really became interested in it. So that's how I was kind of dragged into this field. Then I think the last 2 years I've also concentrated a little bit more work on the climate migration security nexus. Very difficult. The relationship between climate and migration is a difficult one, and also in the literature a contested one. There is hardly any data, and especially in light of the refugees coming to Europe and the migrants coming to Europe, but also the migration security interface is very sensitive because there is a risk if you talk too much about migration in security terms that this will strengthen xenophobia and populist ideas. But on the other hand, it also needs to be addressed. And so I've started to work on these kinds of topics. Another strand of work that we did quite a bit of work on was the issue of land restoration. So the issue of land degradation across the world, but especially in Africa, and how efforts are being made to restore lands, but also how this is related to the conflict and security agenda. Rather innovative new work, which is a bit, let's say, more on the ground than climate change. Climate change is a little bit more abstract, land degradation and people, needing to live from the land is perhaps a bit more concrete. So these are just a few examples.
Sure. And these are interesting areas of work. There's very few people that we've interviewed so far or that we even have coming up that are in these spaces. So that I'm going to pick your brain a little bit on each of the three that you mentioned, just because listeners will maybe be hearing some of this for the first time. Migration, can we start there? What a sensitive topic, as you described, and not a lot of data as well as you described. So where does one even begin? How do you begin to tackle something like this? And what do your findings, what are the implications of that for different governments that are having to deal with this very real issue that is very current?
Yeah, so you can imagine, if climate change hits your country, then it's more difficult it affects food, water scarcity. So it's a kind of logical thing that you might want to consider people to leave, or if you have a flood, or if your island is sinking in the sea. So people see the connection between climate change and migration. But then the question is really, where do they go to? Do they go to the nearby city, or do they come to Europe? And if they come to Europe, then here in Europe, I work in a European think tank, it becomes politically insensitive. And the problem is that in the field of, let's say, migration economics, there is this very strong theory, the migration hump, which says people only migrate if they have the means to do so, at least to Europe. And it is believed that because of climate change, they lack the means, so they will, crudely say, starve on the countryside in Africa and not have the, or the Middle East for that matter, and not have the means to come to Europe. But I always think, well, that's not, a longer term story, because people who are deprived from livelihoods, basic conditions in life, might indeed not have the means immediately to pay human smugglers to come to Europe. But eventually they might be attracted to radicalization organizations, conflict might emerge, and then they might have to leave even without the means almost. So I don't think it's a satisfactory story. And then if you turn it around, if you think about, let's say, the policies which are put in place to address migration from a European perspective, it's very much about having security forces in North Africa, in the Middle East, making agreements with countries to stop the flows of migrants coming from these countries, but not, well, to a much lesser extent, really addressing these root causes of migration. And of course, one reason why people migrate is always the attraction of, Europe is better, and the income disparity, which is inequality, which is there. So that's the push factor. But yeah, these other factors, which not only have to do with climate change, but which some can be related to climate change, which belong to the root causes of this migration, that if you start to think about how to address them, by, for instance, trying to create jobs on the countryside, then again climate change can come into the picture. By doing renewable energy projects, by land restoration projects, water projects, agricultural projects, which make the countries more resilient, create jobs, and then also maybe stop migrants. But once you openly say that, then people are angry and they say, yeah, you just relabel, repackage development cooperation, which might in a way be true, but I think still, in the end of the day, a lot of the development cooperation is is already politicized, and then if migration is a priority, I'd rather have it spent on these kind of projects than on more security forces or a higher wall. For that matter.
Yeah. So a lot of the things that you are describing around what leads to this migration, and then all of the implications of that, is it similar to talk about conflict? Can you talk about conflict in a similar way? And if yes, let's talk a little bit about the relationship between conflict and migration. Do they also reinforce one another? Where do you get conflict versus migration? I'm curious to see the relationship there.
Yeah, well, it's also to a certain extent disputed. But of course, if, let's say, in a region, massive migration is flowing into a country. This morning we saw during the Planetary Security Conference the example of Lebanon, where now 1/3 or so of the population is a migrant or a displaced person. And you see this is already a society where different groups are, well, it's not easy to live together. They manage, but then it adds, extra pressures on such a society. So I think to deny, let's say, a relationship between migration and security is naive. And the other way around, of course, security conflict is one of the main reasons why people migrate.
This is fascinating. I mean, you're working in a very sensitive space. And being in Europe and being based in Europe, this is a real temporal issue now. And so talk to us a little bit about the work you are currently doing. So we are here at the Planetary Security Initiative. This is something that you have really spearheaded and brought together. And it's an incredible gathering of people from all over the world with various backgrounds contributing to the climate and security nexus. And so what drew you to being involved in this type of organization? And what are you currently working on? What is your current focus?
So for the initiative as such, really indeed the objective is to bring these different communities together, to have a good mix of people from across the world, but also from the PSI, as we call it, spotlight regions, Mali, Iraq, Lake Chad and the Caribbean, to really think about what can be done there to reduce and reverse security risks emanating from climate change. And this focus on, let's say, doable or action is very much a red thread throughout this conference, and I hope also in the aftermath of it. So I think with the Planetary Security Initiative over the years, we've really managed to, let's say, go from awareness on this topic, which was already existing before, since about 2007, when the whole debate on climate as a threat multiplier started off, until, let's say, now the last 2-3 years where really it's recognized in specific regions, in the UN Security Council, first actions are undertaken to do something about it. And this is also, I think, very much in line with my own recent work. For instance, we are working on a background paper for the Global Commission on Adaptation. And this centers very much around the question of how climate adaptation measures can also contribute to conflict prevention and peace-building efforts, and really showcasing practical examples and making the case that if you undertake actions, not necessarily projects, but actions to adapt to climate change, this can also have, let's say, broader benefits than just development.
Sure.
I mean, that's already super beneficial, but then you can also help with creating more stability and peace, basically, in a country. And then you should think about, concrete projects about water cooperation, land restoration, strengthening food, climate resilient agricultural activities. So all these climate adaptation activities that can really help in creating also jobs for youth, livelihoods. Really.
So there's many benefits here,
and
if
also,
you think about adapting.
Yeah, and also these projects that manage to bring together groups in society which would otherwise be at loggerheads. The moment you start discussing how to share the resources which are becoming increasingly scarce, whether it's energy or food or water or land, the moment you get together and you talk about it, and climate change is perhaps your common enemy, that can also have, wider spin-offs. But anyways, it's a very optimistic, maybe even naive picture, but I think it should be possible. And of course, we should also recognize that there is risks that, for instance, the increased adaptation funding, which is expected, is going to be also like normal development cooperation being used in the wrong way. And there's also examples that it was used to help the farmers, but then the herders in the same region were not happy with it, so you should avoid maladaptation. But I think the general message is that it can also have this peace dividend. Yeah.
So climate change can really create enemies that we hear, but then also here's opportunity to band together and to overcome some of these challenges, because there's a shared interest in making sure that the land that we live on doesn't necessarily, and the water that we share doesn't recognize national borders. Yeah. And so for that reason, there's an opportunity for real collaboration here. And that brings me back to your first point when you were talking about the 3 examples that you gave of what you're working on. So land degradation. Can you give us a specific, you were talking about how you're working on this report for the Commission, and there's some concrete examples. What's an example of how to solve some of the land degradation issues?
Well, there are several examples of, let's say, good land restoration projects. For instance, the work what the Common Land is doing, or what happened with the Lus Plateau in China, or in Rwanda by USAID. Several interesting projects were implemented. But of course, one of the biggest examples where also this peace aspect is more prominent is in the Sahel region, the Great Green Wall, but also activities by the Triple S initiative, Stability, Security, Stability, where really they try to make an effort to restore lands and contribute in that way to, let's say, a more positive agenda that also creates stability in this region. And this is, of course, a super sensitive region with huge population growth forecasts, close to Europe, terrorist organizations and recruitment. So that's of big significance.
Lots of factors playing in there that need to be considered.
Yeah.
So what can people do who are listening to this podcast? We have listeners from all over the world who are thinking, there's such interesting work going on, but how can I contribute to it? There's the challenge, it seems so vast, and the idea of conflict, migration, land degradation just seems like an individual can't really play a significant role. What do you say to those who say, I'd like to get involved, and what can I do to help your cause and to help further your progress?
I think there are several NGOs that are active in this space and multilateral organizations. But I think also, in a way, accepting that, of course, we need to halt climate change, so we need to reduce emissions and try to get, on this 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees path. But also accept in a way that nevertheless, there might be consequences of climate change, which also have security risks. So that also, let's say, in your, vote or in your news preferences, that is being taken into account. Yeah.
So Americans are waking up in the sense that there is greater support for the fact that climate change is happening than ever before. We've tipped the scale to 70% of Americans do believe that that is the case. But I wonder, what is the attitude in Europe here towards that, towards climate change awareness, and how does it compare to the US? And what do Europeans think about how Americans think about climate change? We actually haven't talked about that yet.
At least if I speak for my own country,
Sure.
The awareness is super high at the moment. And also there are now a lot of, government proposals that are being discussed to really get the Netherlands onto a path of 49% emission reduction in 2030, going into carbon neutral in 2050. If these plans would be adopted, it's sensitive because also there's a bit of resistance in society to this. But if these plans will be adopted, then it really make a change. We see a youth movement coming up here in the Netherlands and also in other European countries protesting for climate, teenagers protesting. And also we see a tendency for people to prefer to eat more sustainable, less meat. Flying, taking airplanes is more contested. So I think in my own country, it is really changing a lot. And also the government policy changed a lot because the gas exploration that we had in a part of our country caused some small earthquakes, and that caused a lot of anxiety among the population in the region. So that it was decided that we should stop with the gas exploration. So we also have to make a shift at this point in time. That being said, it's really a challenge to have this not as a kind of elitist project, and also to make sure that the climate measures that are eventually chosen are the ones that also take account for, let's say, an equal share of the burden. Because it will take an investment to make this energy transition. The costs, for instance, for getting a household out of the gas are enormous. If it's considered that only the households will have to pay it and not the big multinationals, then it's going to be politically difficult. If it's going to be perceived as a very elitist project, so that the rich can still afford, to refurbish their houses and buy an electric car and what have you, and the ordinary man not, then it's going to cause, I think, political issues.
Sure. So something very practical to keep in mind as we move towards implementation of a lot of these things that we're talking about.
Yeah.
So, Louise, thank you so much for your time and the work that you do with your think tank and with the Planetary Security Initiative. The conference was an incredible gathering of stakeholders from all over the world who have a vested interest in this space. So, fantastic work on your end, and please do come back and join us on the podcast again. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Climate and Security Podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Please tweet me directly at SWETAC or the Center for Climate and Security's Twitter handle. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, write a review on iTunes, share widely, and finally, consider donating to the podcast from the Center of Climate and Security's podcast page, www.climateendsecurity.org/podcast, by clicking on Make a Donation. We will continue the series of conversations with the most prolific and dedicated folks in this space, and your support is greatly appreciated. Thank you, and please tune in again for the next episode of the Climate and Security Podcast.